What I want you to be aware, of course, is that we are live and on the air, so we need two things. One, we need to keep noise to a minimum. We appreciate that. If you have your cell phone, would you please silence that cell phone? I would really appreciate you doing that. Starting out, we're going to go live in just a few minutes. Now, when you have questions, what I'd like you to do is we're going to give each of our panelists about 5 minutes worth of remarks, and then we'll have some questions. So as soon as you have a question, we're going to just go down the line here. So when you get close to our last speaker, if you want to go ahead and come up and stand at one of the 2 mics to be ready to ask your question, that would be great, because we don't want to have that dead air time while we walk up there or something. And we really would like to have the questions. We appreciate that greatly. First I want to thank you all for coming to this first panel discussion. And I'll get some signals here pretty soon. It's when we start, I'll try to pass it on to you, and we'll get our broadcast going. And again, thank you all for being here. You guys are being really good. Yeah. What do you find the right place? It's the right crowd. This is where you can help. Thank y'all very much. I appreciate it. Anybody have any quick questions before they go to the council or anything? So just take a while. Need to make sure I turn myself on.
Oh, you do that like
No, not like you.
Yeah.
They have to work. Yeah, sure.
Two-minute warning.
Just for those, if I can have a live mic, that'd be great. All right. Thank you. For those of you coming late, we really appreciate you being here. Just want to remind you that this is going to be a live broadcast on KEDT.
1 minute.
In 1 minute, it's going to start. So if you would like to ask a couple things, please start being very quiet for us. We appreciate that. If you have your cell phone with you, which I'm sure most of you do, please turn those to silent. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. We'll make some short presentations first, and then if you have a question, please walk up to one of these two mics. Do it early. Just go up there and stand because we don't want to have a dead air. Then we don't have a dead air.
Stand by. Five. Four. Three. Two. One.
Hello, and I want to welcome you to both our audience here at the TMUCC Performing Arts Center and our listeners on KEDT to the first of a series of 3 panel discussions on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The panel is hosted by the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies here at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi. I am Dr. Larry McKinney. I'm the Executive Director of HRI, and I would like to thank KEDT for broadcasting this discussion to our community. Specifically, I want to thank Don Dunlap, General Manager, Stuart Jacoby, the Director of Programming, and Shane Barker, the normal voice of KEDT. He's behind the box today, so he's setting a high bar for me. I'm trying not to be too nervous performing in front of him. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to remind the audience that you will have the opportunity to ask questions. There's mics here to come forward with. And for those of you who are listening on KEDT, you can get questions to us through the web by going to questions, QUESTIONS, questions at KEDT.org. KEDT.org. Please include your first name and location with your question. Let's get started. Since the biggest oil spill in U.S. history began to unfold April 20th with an explosion that killed 11 workers aboard an offshore drilling rig, crude oil has been found, or has found, some 125 miles of the Louisiana coastline and has washed up in Alabama and Mississippi and is now threatening Florida, even as far as the Florida Keys. Over the past 6 weeks, the well has leaked anywhere from 21 million gallons to 45 million gallons by the government estimate, making it the largest oil spill in U.S. history, some 2 to 4 times that of Exxon Valdez. The ecological and economic impacts have been significant, and they're expanding daily. More than 1/3 of the federal waters in the Gulf are now off-limits to fishing, along with hundreds of square miles of state water. The impacts of wildlife and coastal wetlands have been graphically and sadly obvious over the last several days. If you have seen the videos of pelicans and shorebirds covering oil, you know what I mean. It's a sickening and really sad situation. The status of underwater plumes of the oil and their potential impact are unknown and certainly of great concern to us. Oil is moving into the loop current and being trapped in the gyre, the offshoot of the loop current that has formed up, and potentially that has far-reaching impacts as well. To try to help us understand all of this, I have asked our experts from the Hart Research Institute, who between them have worked on nearly every significant oil spill, both here in the U.S. and around the world over the last 30 years. And I would refer you to our website, hartresearchinstitute.org, for details on their background and the things that HRI is doing regarding this tragic event. As I said, we'll take questions following some brief introductory remarks, but first let me introduce our panel. First to speak will be Dr. Tom Shirley. Dr. Shirley is the HRI Chair for Biodiversity and Marine Conservation. He'll be followed by Dr. Paul Montagna, who is the HRI Chair for Ecosystem Studies, and the wrap-up will be Dr. David Goskowitz, who is the HRI Chair for Socioeconomics. So at this time, I want to turn the mic over to Dr. Shirley and let him begin.
Thank you, Larry. Most of the concerns and the efforts with the Deep Horizon oil blowout, that's what I call it, has been with containing the shoreward movement of oil to prevent it from contaminating the beaches, the estuaries, and the marshes. And really gallant efforts have been made to prevent the oil from coming ashore. You know all the methods, the booms and skimming and burning of the oil and the use of dispersants. And I think that all of these concerns and efforts are well placed, as these are vital productive habitats and nursery areas for many marine species. However, what I'm going to talk about today are the somewhat overlooked species in the still management. There are literally thousands of species that live in the offshore habitat in the water column. That's that portion of the water between the surface and the bottom, and also at the bottom of the sea. These multitudes of species contribute to the functioning of the marine ecosystem and provide many services that benefit coastal communities. And my take on this is kind of like if you take apart a watch or a large clock, and you'll find all of these gears, at least you would in pre-electronic days, and you'll find lots of small wheels. And a lot of people might think, well, I'll just leave out one of those little wheels and put the watch back together. Well, it might not work right. Well, you think of the same way with all these animals in the ecosystem. So a lot of those little things may be very important to keep things functioning right. So last year, that's in June of last summer, the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies published an all-species inventory of the Gulf of Mexico. That's 15,419 species. This was with the help of 140 experts that were authors for this text from 80 institutions in 15 countries. Well, we have, over the past year, taken this remarkable 1,400-page volume and converted it into a digital database. And we're striving to convert it into a web searchable base with a toolkit that will allow people to ask diversity questions about what lives where and what habitats and what depths. And that's what I wanted to share with you just briefly. So we know that from the northeast octant of the Gulf, that's the area that contains the Deep Horizon oil well, there are 8,332 species of plants and animals. If we just discuss only a few of the major groups of animals at all depths in the region of the spill, there are 1,461 species of mollusks, that's the clams and snails, 604 polyps, the marine worms that are related to earthworms, 1,503 crustacean species, that's the crabs and shrimps and animals like that, but also 1,250 different fish species, 4 sea turtles, 218 birds, 29 marine mammals, and I could go on and on if I mentioned the lesser groups. A somewhat sobering and ironic aspect is that in the area surrounding the Deep Horizon well, that is at the depths, those depths, there is the highest species richness, that's the greatest number of species for anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico. And frankly, I was surprised when I saw the data. It was an unbiased finding. We just looked at our data set and asked a question, and that's what pops out. 1,728 species of animals at that depth, and that's within the 1,000 to 3,000 meter depth range within our polygon. The Deep Horizon well is about 1,500 meters. This area is truly the biodiversity hotspot for the deep Gulf of Mexico based on current explorations. Within all depths, this area has 135 unique species described from and based only on these explorations. 74 species from this area are listed as threatened or endangered, including 6 marine mammals and 4 sea turtles. And if we look at the northeast quadrant of the Gulf, that's the one quarter of the Gulf that includes the oil well. There are 2,797 species found nowhere else in the Gulf. So there's lots of species in this area that most people don't think about. What we think about are the oil birds and the marshes and the other things that we see from shore. There's a big diversity of things that are beneath the surface. And I'll stop there and pass on.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that greatly. Once again, I want to remind our listening audience that you too can participate in this discussion by submitting your questions to questions@kbbt.org. Questions@kbbt.org. Please include your first name and location and your location with those questions. So now I want to move to Dr. Paul Montagna to give us his perspective on this bill. So, Dr. Montagna.
Thank you, Larry. Well, obviously, since the spill has happened and the blowout has happened, I've been getting one or two real primary questions. What effects will this have and how long will the effects last? And I can tell you right now that we really don't know the answer exactly. But we certainly can base some well-grounded projections using past research as a guide. And I started working on oil and gas issues way back in 1975, and I've seen a lot of different, worked on a lot of different aspects of this, so I can give you some thoughts on that. You know, the first thing we have to realize, of course, is that oil is toxic. And it's also carcinogenic when it breaks down into smaller particles. Now, there's the good news, bad news situation here. When the oil hits the surface, it will start to degrade, that we call process weathering. And as oil degrades, it actually becomes less toxic over time. But then something bad starts to happen later on, and that is as the oil starts getting into the shorelines and mixing with sediments and marsh areas and in the estuaries, it gets buried. And when it gets buried, it will degrade again, but now as it degrades, it starts releasing the smaller compounds again, which are toxic again. And for example, in Exxon Valdez, one thing that was found was that even though after 5-10 years, there wasn't toxicity toward the adult population, there was still toxicity toward the juvenile populations, particularly those who were spending part of their life cycle in the sediments. The other problem, of course, is bioaccumulation. Oil can be taken up directly across the gills of fish, and it could be absorbed directly into small plants and other animals that live in the water column. Now, this obviously is a problem because no one wants to eat an oyster or a fish that has oil in its tissues. It's obviously going to be tasting bad, and this is one reason why the fishing areas have been closed in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, you know, we see a little good news, bad news. One of the good things about oil well is it doesn't really biomagnify. Biomagnification is where a big fish eats lots of little fish, and each of the little fish are contaminated, and the concentration gets even higher when we have trophic levels. Well, where oil is different is that many fish have the ability to metabolize the oil, and so we don't see the biomagnification in food chains. It will biomagnify from the plankton to the copepods to the small fish in the lower part of the food chain because they do not have the ability to metabolize oil. But once it gets into the fish, the concentration stays about the same. As Tom said, this is a very unique area in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the most productive part of the Gulf of Mexico. It's actually not a coincidence that this is where most of the oil is found. Oil, as you well know, is a fossil fuel, meaning that these were organisms that were deposited, you know, many many, many millions of years ago. And of course, that productivity is a direct result of nutrients flowing from the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is an area where we have especially high prime production, high secondary production. It's an area where we know we have spawning grounds for many of the large pelagic species like whales and dolphins and tuna. And so we have a lot of resources at risk in this area. One of the issues then is where is the damage or where are the effects occurring? And in this particular environment, unfortunately, it's occurring everywhere. Again, in shallow water areas, typically oil just flows directly to the surface and it disperses over a very thin layer of sheen. And it's mostly the surface animals that are hurt. In this case, something completely different is happening. It's a lot like your Windex bottle. You've got a pool of liquid in the bottle, you pressure it up, you shoot it out through a fine nozzle, and you create that mist. That's what the oil is doing at this depth. And that mist, the oil is turning into a mist of lots of tiny droplets, and it's dispersing throughout the entire water column. So what we're seeing in this case is that whereas you wouldn't expect effects in the bottom and in the water per se, only at the surface, that's not happening here. Every indication is that the oil is having effects throughout the entire water column, and of course the benthos as well. At that point, I guess I'll just go ahead and turn to Larry again.
Thank you, Paul, very much. Before I introduce our rapid speaker on this summary remarks, and believe me, knowing that I have my professors here, any professors, to get them to stop lecturing after 5 minutes is a real challenge. They're doing a great job, which I appreciate it. But one of the things that we do at HRI, and one of our trademarks, is that our objective is to bring together scientists of all types, geologists and biologists, together with marine policy experts and economics, and look at how we can take the best available science and solve problems. Of course, this is a huge problem. But one of the ways that we really can see these problems manifested is through economics. And I would tell you that this bill is already affecting us. It's had effects all around the Gulf. And I'll illustrate it with 2 points. We have this wonderful oyster recycling program that was started in partnership with the Water Street restaurants, where they, of course, sell oysters on the half shell. And in the past, that shell would just go in the landfill. And so we started a program with them to collect that oyster shell and take it back out and build reefs with it. And typically, every 3 to 4 days, we'll collect from that one restaurant anywhere from 200 to 400 pounds of oyster shell, which is quite significant. Right now, we're collecting about a 5-gallon bucket of oyster shell because the oyster shell fishery is so impacted, there's no oysters available. On the other side of the Gulf, I have friends in Merida who are commercial fishermen. They fish for grouper, and I got an email message from them yesterday. They have 80,000 pounds of fresh grouper that they can't sell to anyone, and it's the very basis of their economics of this small community. They're charged they're going to freeze that and do something else with it. They're going to lose huge amounts of money because of that. Of course, we've all seen the impacts, the direct impacts in Louisiana. So translating to environmental economics is a big issue and one very important to us. And we're very lucky to have Dr. David Yaskowitz as our chair of socioeconomics at HRI. I'm going to turn over to him for a summary.
Thank you. Well, there is a lot that we don't know at this point. Although you would think with the amount of media requests that myself and colleagues around the Gulf have been getting, everybody wants us to put a dollar value on the impact. And it's way too early to be able to do that. What I would like to do is spend a couple of minutes putting in perspective what we do about the Gulf. Last year, the Texas A&M University Press published a book in a series of books looking at the ocean and coastal economy of the Gulf of Mexico. As part of that book, we were able to calculate what we call the productive value of the Gulf of Mexico. And basically what that is focusing on 4 big sectors of the Gulf economy: oil and gas, tourism, commercial fisheries, and shipping. What is the impact of those sectors as a result of being on the Gulf of Mexico? So we did this study for both the U.S. and Mexico. We weren't able to include Cuba for various reasons. What we found was that productive value, the fact that these economies were based upon workings of the Gulf in terms of the ecology, location, etc. What we found is that the Gulf of Mexico had a productive value in 4 sectors of $234 billion each year. Now, what does that mean? I mean, that's a large amount, but in what context can we put that in? If the Gulf of Mexico was its own country based on those 4 sectors of the economy, it ranked 29th out of 230 countries around the world. That economy, the Gulf of Mexico, would be larger than Chile and Peru and Venezuela and Finland. So that's a significant productive resource that we have in the Gulf in terms of those 4 sectors. What we did about 4 weeks ago, I think now, is shortly after the blowout happened, Larry approached me and said, can we get a sense of what potentially could be the impact? And so based on some very preliminary numbers that I believe NOAA had put out, looking at what the potential impact on wetlands were, possibly 500,000 acres when all was said and done. And those numbers grow and shrink on a daily basis. But based on 500,000 acres of wetland potentially impacted, what we found, if you look at the commercial, recreational, and tourism industry, how that would be impacted, as well as the ecosystem services, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, that would come up to about $1.6 billion a year just for the impact of 500,000 acres of wetlands. Not counting oyster reefs, not counting dunes or barrier islands, just for wetlands. Now, a big chunk of that number, $1.2 billion, was attributed to ecosystem services. And what do we mean by ecosystem services? Well, we as humans enjoy the benefits received from our natural environment that we don't take into account through a market system. A big part of the services might be what we call storm protection or waste regulation. So if we're looking at wetlands, they're really good at doing a lot of things. One of the things they're really good at doing is protecting us from storm surge. So looking at storm surge and wastewater treatment as services in addition to recreational and commercial fishing, that accounted for $1.2 billion of that figure. So the commercial side, the market side of things that we could get a figure on that everybody really understands was significant. It's about $400 million. But a large majority of the value that we get from our natural environment is the things that we don't take into account every day, but are nonetheless extremely important to us. And I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Dr. Yoskowitz. What I want to do is give an opportunity to our presenters. I know we asked them to be brief, but if there's remarks they want to make while they're doing that, if you have questions here in the audience, please come up to the mics now and be ready to ask those questions. Those of you who are listening and participating in our audience, again, you have the opportunity to participate as well, and that is by submitting your questions to questions@kedt.org. Please include your first name and your location with that question. We have a question in the audience, so please go ahead.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
I'm Mary Jo Rear, and I'm a local historian. I have 2 questions. I was in New Orleans about 2.5 weeks ago and was talking with one of the natives there about the oil spill. He said that the owner of the corporation that developed microbes that eat oil had come to New Orleans and offered his services to BP. Now, I'm familiar with the corporation because those microbes did a lot of cleaning up here in the area a few years ago. What he said was that BP refused the services because they didn't want to lose the oil, they wanted to reclaim it and resell it. So I guess my first question is, does any of this make sense? The other question is, if when oil, as it already has done, gets into the loop, will it come back around within a year and hit the Texas Gulf, the Texas part of the Gulf Coast, where we are?
That's 2 very good questions. One is based on Michael, letting our panelists to get an answer to that, I would tell you on the micro type of thing, that is one, as far as, could they reclaim the oil that's coming short? No, not really. Once it gets mixed with water, it emulsifies, and it won't even burn at that point. So there's not really much of that recommendation that you could do in that situation. But microbial, breaking down with microbes, is frankly our best possibility there too. From the panel members, do you have anything to add on that? Paul, Dr. Montano.
Yeah, you know, I actually spent a lot of years studying microbial decomposition of oil back in our Santa Barbara days. And it is true that oil seeps naturally into the environment, and so there are sweeps of bacteria in the environment that degrade oil. With genetic engineering, you could probably create superbugs that eat even better. But I would caution these people on a couple of issues. Number one, that works best at the surface where it's warm, you have light and a lot of oxygen, because bacteria require oxygen to grow. Recall my comments earlier. One of the big problems right now is that oil is dispersed throughout the water column. And a lot of it is in the deep sea. And the deep sea is imagine being inside your icebox with the weight of a mile of water sitting on top of your chest. So it's cold, it's dark, and the pressure's high. I can also tell you, because I tried to measure rates of decomposition in the deep sea, it's almost immeasurable. Whereas I could measure rates on the order of years in like 50 feet of water. When we tried to measure microbial composition rates in deep water, it was like thousands of years. So I really have concerns about how quickly the bacteria can solve the problem, given the deep sea nature of it. And by the way, I'd like to add something else to your general comment, and that is, how do people bring good ideas to BP? One of the things that surprised me is I've heard from many people have contacted me about, I've got a good idea, but I can't get BP to listen. I've heard this many times, and it makes me wonder myself how open the system is to allow entrepreneurs or just people with good ideas to help out in a crisis like this. I just don't know the answer to that.
I would like to make one statement about the bioremediation, which is the use of the microbes. I worked with the Exxon Valdez oil spill for about 2 years, and bioremediation came up there, and yes, microbes degrade oil, and it works well on the surface, it's better in warm environments. But one of the concerns is they usually do not add bacteria per se, but nutrients to enhance the growth of the bacteria. And the propellants that are used to disperse those nutrients are in fact often toxic to many of the macrophones. So they'll kill lots of animals while they're degrading the oil. So that's pros and cons of that.
The plus thing for the Gulf of Mexico is, and I think Dr. Montano and Dr. both mentioned it, is that we do have natural seeps oil coming to the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, there's something like that, 500,000 to 1.5 million barrels a year, but over about 600,000 square miles, so it's very much spread out. But what that has done is over time has evolved a really well-developed microbial community that consumes oil. So the Gulf has been well inoculated well before these spills happen to help at least address it. That's not the only positive thing that I can think of from that. Your second part of your question was the loop current, and I thought somewhere we'd have a question, is this going to affect Texas? And how could it affect Texas? And one thing that this oil spill has done, I think more people know about the loop current now than maybe ever before, because it's been everywhere and that type of thing. But it's a really good question, and that's a great concern, because as we've watched over the last several days, one of the things that happens with the loop current is these gyres, these bubbles of water, routinely about this time of year begin to break off and move. So I'm going to let I think all of you guys talk about anyone else wants to keep going.
Yeah, right now, in a way, the spill happened at a good time of the year for Texas because of these three important details. Number one, the loop current is actually not quite as strong in the spring as it is in the summer. And also, we see less of these meanders and rings flooding off the loop current in the spring and the summer. And of course, we don't have storms. But now we have the shoe drops. As we move into July, the loop current will start to pick up momentum. And the other thing that happens is we get these rings or meanders or eddies that spin off to the northwest off the loop current. And so if there is oil at the surface or the subsurface areas close enough to where those meanders are, you can literally train oil and start moving toward the Texas coast. That's a kind of oceanographic process that's a little stronger in July, August, and September. The other thing, of course, is, as we all know, what else happens in July, August, and September, and that is, tropical storms. And I think once the tropical storm season starts hitting, all bets are off. The oil's going to be moved throughout the Gulf in whatever direction the storm is moving. And the worst thing is the storm surge is going to push it up off the beaches and off the, if you could build berms to protect the Gulf, those berms will quickly get washed out. You all know what happens to our beaches during even a small storm. Sand berms just not going to withstand it for more than a few hours. And then it's going to be projected higher.
Thank you, Dr. Montaigne. We have a question from our listening audience, so we can hear that question.
Richard from Rockport wants to know what is the composition of the liquid that is being sprayed on floating oil from those planes, and how safe is it to humans, plants, and marine life?
The dispersant, I guess. You want to take that?
I guess I can take something too.
Yeah.
I only know this from reading up on it because when they first started using dispersant, we were curious about it ourselves. And so, interestingly, the name of the dispersant is Corexit. Get it? And it's essentially a detergent. Unfortunately, it has about the same toxicity as the oil itself. So it basically adds to the toxic stew.
I would say that one of the dangers of the dispersant is that by breaking the oil down into these micromolecules, micro droplets that bacteria can get at, they can degrade. It also makes the oil more bioavailable. It's easier to pass across membrane. So it has a good side and a dark side. It enhances the potential for degradation of the oil, but and weathering, physical as well as biological degradation, but it also increases its toxicity. My early studies with oil dispersants during my doctoral program, you could have fish in a tank, both static and flow-through systems, and you could have very low toxicity of oil to the fish, and you add a dispersant. It would increase the toxicity multifold. Now, by itself, the dispersants are often of low toxicity. These two formulas that were used, Corexit 9500 and 95.7, are generally labeled as among the milder of the less toxic of the dispersants.
And that does bring to one of the questions, we have another question I just want to get to in a second, but for me and a number of us that have been looking at this spill, the biggest, greatest concern, and unanswered question is and we've alluded to in some of our presentations, is these plumes, the underwater plumes that are created as the oil is released. It comes off the bottom. And there's been a great deal of discussion about dispersants being used at that. No one's ever done that before. We have no experience with it. And what's the impact? Is it helping or hurting? And of course, the objective there is to break that oil up into small droplets before it reaches the surface, making it more biodegradable and accessible to microbes and weathering and that type of thing. But a number of us, again, have concerns. And these, by the way, these plumes would form with or without these dispersants. That's just as Dr. Montaigne referred, it's just like a spray can coming out of it with methane as the propellant and the liquid is on. And there are a number of ships out to sea now looking at these plumes. They found a number of these plumes. One that I'm aware of and talking with the research vessel about is about 82 cubic miles of whatever it is. They don't know. They're trying to figure that out. That basically, to give you some reference, that's about half the volume of Lake Erie, twice the volume of Lake Tahoe. And this particular one was moving toward the DeSoto Canyon. So the concern, and Dr. Shirley hit it very much on the head, and that is if these things maintain their toxicity and these huge clouds moving through the water column, and there are animals, organisms up and down that column, the impacts may far exceed the very harmful horrible ones we're seeing in the wetlands. We just won't see it. Now, we do not know much about these plumes, and that's one of the faults that one of the concerns all of them. We should have perhaps in the past done this type of work, so we would know better about it, but we do not. And many of us who have the concerns that this was a mistake, this is a big issue, we certainly hope we're going to be proven wrong about the nature of these plumes, and we're working on it very closely right now. We have a question here from the audience.
Yes, thank you. My name is Brian Burke, and you sent professionals on the house. The New York Times last week published 2 articles about findings of research vessels in the Gulf, finding those large plumes to the west and the east of where the flood occurred. And these plumes are miles long, miles wide, and hundreds of feet deep, and the composition is a combination of the dispersed oil, the methane, and acid sediment. The articles did say it was clear it was going to affect the food chain from the very bottom, the eggs, the larvae, all the way up to the sharks that swim to the surface, and there is very little research on what these plumes are made of and what they'll bring about over a period of time. So my question is, partly, was the use of dispersants on the seashore at the blowout site, did that add to the pressure that acidified the oil? And also, are we looking at the future where these huge plumes may be floating around the Gulf for the next couple of years?
We've kind of heard mine on this kind of index. I think that is an index. To me, that's the $64,000 question, whatever it is. It's trying to figure that out.
I guess I didn't answer my question.
Well, but it's worth spending some time on it because of that. And the question is, will it be around for a long time? Yes, it will, because they are obviously in the deep water. They're going to move. It'll be a further question. Do they maintain themselves as a cloud, or do they slowly disperse, or what? We just don't know, and that's a serious concern. As I said, the oil would have analyzed without the dispersants, just because of the physics of the situation. But what additive effect that the dispersants may have had, mixing with that, Dr. Shirley made that very eloquent just then, that the combination of the two is not good in any situation. Do anyone have anything to add to that?
Well, I have the same concerns. Again, I've never studied dispersants and oil mixes per se exactly, but it struck me as a playbook designed for shallow water and a very small spill, and it was just, the wrong toolkit at the time. When we have a problem with the oil being dispersed naturally, why on earth do we want to disperse it even more? And now I'm getting into a little bit of editorializing off the science, but I got to tell you that I've been very disappointed that more effort wasn't placed on trying to pick it up at the surface and skim it, rather than trying to make it go away out of sight, out of mind.
Thank you.
Is this the first time we've seen a major oil spill where the oil didn't all go to the surface and into the beach? Is this the first time we've seen it?
Most oil spills, in fact, occur at the surface. Most spills are spills, and they're not blowouts. And the blowouts that we have had have pretty much been in shallow water. Most of them are in transport, rupturing the tanker walls.
We have another question from our listeners through the internet. Please, thank you.
Michael says, the President announced that drilling was to be stopped on the 33 exploratory wells that are also in progress. What safety precautions will be in place to keep these holes under control? It seems that it would be safer to continue on drilling since there are people on site keeping an eye on well control. One can be assured that these personnel are paying the utmost attention. Having to depend on unsupervised or at best remotely supervised equipment with no one on hand to deal directly with any upset is not as comforting a thought.
I'm not sure if I think there are people on those rigs. They may have just been stopped. But I think the question you're probably getting at, and that is one that we're going to have to learn, because it's a very important question to discover. Basically, what caused this in the first place? And you have three choices, or three possibilities. One is a technological failure, where basically the design of the equipment was either inadequate or not adequate for the depths it was being used, and some technological failure. There is, of course, the human mistakes. perhaps inattention to maintenance that has been come up. So that those type of things are a combination of those three things. The cautious thing to do is to stop those activities right now, because if it is a technological failure, then all of those wells, all using the same basic technology, are at risk. If it was a human fault or a combination, then we need to discover that too. So the caution at this point is to stop that activity until that is discovered, and I think that was the basis of that decision. I don't know if anyone has other additions.
Well, one particularly unusual thing that happened in this site is that there were these methyl hydrate crystals. And this has not been encountered in most other drilling sites. This is hydrated methane. These look actually like large water balloons. It's methane mixed with water to form a crystalline lattice. And when these are destabilized by changes in pressure or temperature, well, then they release the gas. And it's thought that this is what happened with this particular blowout, that the setting of the concrete collar increased heat and caused a rapid release of gas. And this was the gas that shot up and caused the initial damage. This doesn't occur everywhere. Yes, I think that the power of nature was pointed out to us again by this oil well, and how little control we have over some of these forces once we let them out of the bottle, so to speak. And I question whether or not we should be trying to tap into these until we have good mechanisms of coping with them, and we're certainly being tested now.
One of the, before we go into, we've been talking a lot here about the biology and technology and those types of things, but I want to, before we go to other questions which we have here, I want to ask a question about the Oscars for a second. And that is an issue of, as he talked about, ecosystem services. As he mentioned in his summary, one of the biggest economic impacts from all this, beyond the commercial recreational fishing aspects that most of us are familiar with, was a loss of ecosystem services. So I think it's very important, and it will be more so as this spill spreads, because even if they're fortunate to stop what's going on now, we still have some 40 days or so of oil out of the water that's going to come ashore, and it is coming ashore in different places. And so they're going to be affecting over a long term this idea of ecosystem services. So I'd like for him to give a little bit more of an explanation on that.
Well, I can tell you that, it's going to be a long process for us to find out what the economic impacts will be as they relate to the services. One thing that I have heard from the General Counsel for NOAA is that in the damage assessment process, or NERDA, Natural Resource Damage Assessment process, ecosystem services, the value of the services that we get from our natural environment will be part of that damage assessment process. So that's a big step forward. And as I had mentioned just a moment ago in my opening comments, is that in a lot of cases, the services that we receive from our natural environment outweigh the marketed services that we typically think of, such as commercial, recreational fisheries and tourism. So what I think that might mean in the long run is a larger bill that somebody's going to be paying.
We have a question from our audience, please.
Yes, I recently heard on Jon Stewart that they were, I guess the oil people had found a lot of ways to get the oil, but no way of how to contain it in every scope. Can you explain why this is basically a lab experiment in the Gulf? I mean, if you could try to contain this, I mean, how come they're just barely trying these new things, and how come that's been tested? Can you elaborate?
I think it's a very good question, basically, why is it? And that is, I think you hit it exactly on the point. Just about everything that we're doing, as we're talking about using dispersants at great depth, dealing with all these issues as we are and not doing well at it, has been basically experimental. I see the pants, I think one government administrator called it. And that's a problem for all of us, because this is something that we should have anticipated, that not the industry, but our regulators should have looked at it. And I'm part of that. All of us that deal with the situation are part of that concern. I served on a federal advisory panel in 2007, which was an advisory panel on ultra-deep exploration, which I thought was listening for the library panel I was ever on. But the whole party was not looking at oil and gas development at 5,000 feet of water, but at 10,000 feet of water. And so a couple of us that had the concerns about environmental issues were raising them then, but the overwhelming push of the committee and direction was, how do we develop better technologies to get even deeper? And so I think one thing we've learned is that we have failed to anticipate the needs of dealing with oil and gas in these depths, that we became complacent with the safety records in the continental shelf areas, which has been very good, and it has not translated as we believe it would. So I'm not giving you a good answer. There's no good answer. There's frankly no excuse.
You know, it's interesting. Again, I started working back when they first built the pipeline in Alaska. And we have what's called an environmental studies budget in the United States for these sorts of issues. But a whole bunch of things have happened in the last 35 years. One, of course, is the industry started in shallow water, and this deep water work is all relatively recent. It's really only since the mid-90s and the late 90s that wells have even gone into production. So the bottom line is, it's all relatively new technology. And one of the things they did is they essentially took the shallow water playbook and just moved it to the deep sea without probably enough study and thinking about, well, what's going to be different. And so, but that's certainly a concern of mine. And then the other thing that has happened is, this deep sea drilling is really only a Gulf of Mexico phenomenon. This is not what's going on in the Gulf of Alaska or in California. The other two areas where we have offshore and gas development. And yet, even though something like 90%, I think it's 96 or 97% of all the offshore oil and gas comes from the Gulf of Mexico. Now, you would think that with and now, of course, the big challenge is a new frontier, the deep sea. You would think that we would have spent a lot of money to try and figure out, well, don't we need to understand what's different? And I can tell you that for the most part that hasn't happened. And considering that 96% of the oil and gas is coming from the Gulf of Mexico, you would think a large part of the environmental studies budget would be spent in the Gulf of Mexico. I can tell you that's not true either. It's roughly about only a third of it. So even though the other states don't have as much at risk, we don't have some of the issues we have, we don't seem to be getting the resources. So the bottom line is that, I think we failed to do a homework, to be blunt.
For those of you who are listening to us today, you have the opportunity for just a few more minutes to get your question in. If you will have internet access, go to questions@kedt.org. Send those questions in with your name and your location. We have one now. Shane.
What, if anything, has Texas done to protect our coast, especially our wildlife refuges like our beloved whooping cranes habitat? That's from Ricky in Corpus Christi. And a related question from Linda in Port Aransas. Is there a plan to offer oil cleanup training to the civilian population in Texas if it comes our way? And if so, when will that program begin? And who might offer it?
Two responses, two good questions. I would tell you that where we are lucky here in Texas is our barrier island system, so the longest barrier islands in the world. Those sand barriers, just as they protected us from Big Stock almost 30 years ago, that's what we have in front of us that Louisiana doesn't have. And in fact, what they did have, they lost to hurricanes. Their wetlands are exposed directly to this oil, and you see the results yourself. We're lucky in that we have those sand barrier islands, so long as we protect them, we'll be in good shape there, I think, and all we'll have to do with our looking at protecting oil from coming into passage. The second part of your question, yes. In fact, here at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi, we have the National Oil Spill School. And if you are interested, I know that our new director there is working very closely with others around the Gulf to address this very issue, to how we can provide that training and be ready for situations that we have to deal with. So if you are interested, you can certainly contact the City University at the Oil Spill School and get that information, and wish you would. I know they would like to hear from you. That'd be Tony Woods there at the National Oil Spill School. Anything from anyone? Pretty good. Okay. so please. Okay.
Yes, good afternoon, I'm Mary Nicholas. You all know I'm a Center for Coastal Studies here at UCC. I have a question for David Kaskis. David, you mentioned the ecosystem value in terms of wetlands, barrier islands as our forefront and protection from storms. Those wetlands and barrier islands get covered with oil. Of course, we have a huge biological loss, but will they lose their value as storm surge protection?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I'd have to maybe refer part of that question to my colleagues, because it really depends upon what's going to happen to those wetlands. If they get covered, will they die back? And if they die back, then they'll lose some of those services such as storm surge protection. But I'm not sure in terms of the biology, ecology, what we would expect to have happen.
And how about the barrier islands? Those are more structural.
Yes, and so, if we're looking at the barrier islands, and we see the images right now of what they're calling these tar balls or tar pancakes washing up on these beaches. If it just stays within the sand and the beaches, that's one thing. I mean, the services there won't be as impacted. But if we get a tropical storm, it pushes that up into the dunes and starts to impact those vegetation, and that's a different story, and that could seriously impact the services that those barrier islands provide.
Any other comments?
Oil is, of course, toxic to plants too, and the degree of toxicity depends upon the amount of oil and the duration of exposure. Marion certainly knows that, being a toxicity expert. I think we often think of the sand barrier islands as being our protection, and they are, and it's a lot easier to clean up oil off sand, but you also have to think that those sandy beaches are just full of live also. There are the donac shells and the ghost crabs and the ghost shrimp. It's just richly full of life. So right now what's happening in Louisiana, where they're dredging up all of these near-shore sand to produce sand barriers, they're killing lots and lots of organisms while they're doing it, disrupting communities. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, and all of these things. There's a dark side to almost everything you do to try to solve the problem.
Yeah, there are really no good answers to it. It's just trying to take the best shot. We have another question from our audience here.
Back in the 1960s, there was a river, I want to say in Chicago, that lit on fire due to the environmental, industrial pollutants that had been emptied into the river. And it kind of set forth into the environmental movement of the 60s. And then later on, we had, again, an environmental awareness movement with the Exxon Valdez. And I wanted to ask you, just like, how much do you think that this recent incident would add more fire to that environmental movement? Or, like, how will BP be able to kind of like lessen the public environment that people would get from this?
I think one of the points you were going at is what has been the outcomes of these various events, and one of them you were talking about, I think it was Chattahoochee River in Ohio that was there. What has come out of a number of these types of environmental insults have been regulations to address water issues. For example, the Clean Water Act came out of the 60s, and it has been the basis of really turning around the current system around where a number of these rivers no longer catch fire, actually water quality improvement. So it's been very important. And out of the Valdez came the Hospital Response Act and Liability Act as well. And so clearly, I think that it has been unfortunate for us that it takes these kind of tragic incidents to mobilize the political will to move forward and do those things to protect our environment. So that is certainly will be something I think will come out of this incident without any doubt. I'm sure of that. But
The costs that BP is dealing with now and trying to contain this spill will certainly be a motivation to industry to try to come up with solutions prior to drilling deep water again. And that's a positive aspect of this, at least, the costly one.
one of the, I want to ask a question, please go ahead. Yes.
You know, obviously, we don't have any contact with the people who are working this problem. And I think, perhaps you can pick up a phone call, also like the national force. That some of the question is twofold. Is one, was there a double stack on this offshore drilling in most of the world requires a double stack instead of a single stack? This appears to be a single stack. Why would that be the case? The stacking would be able to be brought there. And the second part of the question is the mechanics that they have undertaken. The pumping of the mud was more of a, to me, it seemed to be an attempt to get pressure relief. The weight of that mud is obviously not sufficient to hold that pressure. So you get your pressure relief and you design a line. When the line is to treat the oil, if this had been 1920 on shore, we would be building dikes around Corpus Christi and saving the oil. So in a way, what's happening here appears to that DE is still trying to come up with a way to capture this oil. If you have gone through all these mechanisms and you still see the problem that you have, why couldn't you just lower another DOT onto the stack, create a double stack that was supposedly supposed to be at the beginning, and use that second DOT to do that? Can you also not asking that, because they're certainly not the type of thing.
Well, you make ask a very good question, and frankly, I think probably way beyond our capacity. One of the things that we don't have at the Harvard Research Institute is a very well-developed engineering component, which you clearly could provide. Of course, with the university's engineering program, we hope to correct that in the near future. And certainly, I do have answers. I wrote that note down, and whether I can understand the answers when you get back, I will ask that question and get it forward for you. So I appreciate that greatly. We have another question from our listening audience, so let's please, Shane.
Richard in Rockport asks, once the oil is on the beach sand, how is it cleaned up? Is there a machine that does this? And do we have them here in Oasis County?
In response to that type of thing, if it's on the sand, that actually is relatively straightforward, although the types of things that we're seeing with oil coming in now is really a manual labor approach with shovels and plastic bags and that type of thing, because it's mostly, not mostly, but a lot of it has to do with tar balls and the heavier sheet types of things are coming in, or start coming in there now. So there are some machines that are available, but you always have to be cautious when you look at these kinds of cleanup situations, because you can do more harm than good, with the exception that on the sand beach you have a much broader range of mechanical options than you might in individual weapons.
The issue that we have here in Coastal Bend is the sargassum. How does that muddy the picture? I'm asking a question here.
It doesn't matter, it's certainly complicated, because it is an issue.
I think John wants to jump all
Yeah, well, I guess sargassum would, unfortunately, we have that natural absorbent. It would really wrap it up and mix it up. It would be a real mess if we had to do with that, I'm afraid.
I think so.
As we kind of begin to wrap toward the conclusion, I would wrap up with this and leave our panelists to make some final remarks. One question, I was in the Wattsville area yesterday, as a matter of fact, I got back last night, and we were talking to some folks that came down, and the question was, why should we even care about what's happening there? And the short answer is that these wetlands in Louisiana, and believe me, this is very difficult for a native Texan to talk about something outside of Texas that's better than we have here. But those wetlands in Louisiana are a national treasure. They are 40% of all the wetlands in our country. They're farmed there because 40% of our country drains into that watershed and creeks and carries all of that, all of the sediments and nutrients and so forth to those areas and builds those wetlands. They are tremendously, amazingly productive. They produce more shellfish and seafood than all of the eastern coast areas combined, east coast areas combined. I'm happy to say that, since it's east coast. And so far, but they are under tremendous pressure. As we drop those, as that water comes in from the inland areas and brings the nutrients, a lot of it to me from farming and agriculture and over enrichment type it has become too much for those wetlands to handle. That's why we have created a dead zone from 5 to 7,000 square miles off Louisiana coast almost annually because of that pressure. From the other side, we have channelized and levied the Mississippi to the extent that sediment cannot get out of the channel and into those wetlands to renourish it because they are seen. Every day during this hour that we have talked to here about an area of some areas about the size of 2 football fields have disappeared. They're losing 25 square miles of wetland every year at a tremendous rate because of that loss of sediment and because of the removal of oil and gas under those wetlands, which has caused a very high rate of subsidence and contamination within those wetlands to get at those oil sites and increased erosion. And so they're trapped between a rock and a hard place, and unfortunately I used the analogy on one interview that what we have in the Louisiana wetlands is the nation's toilet, it's a sushi bar, and a gas station all rolled into one. And perhaps I shouldn't put the toilet and the sushi bar together, but the point is that this system has been tremendously resilient and been able to take a tremendous amount of abuse, and I think we've come to take it for granted. But when you get knocked down time after time, when you have a hurricane like Katrina that comes through and overnight removes 135 or 140 square miles of that wetland, when you have now an oil spill like this that has the entire area surrounded and oil coming in from all sides, you have to ask the question, how many times can you continue to get knocked down before you can't get back up again? And that is the long-term concern that we all have. It is the mission and the focus of the Hart Research Institute, working with all the other entities in the Gulf of Mexico, to try to figure out a way to bring everyone together, bring these issues together, and look at how we can maintain the ecological health of the Gulf of Mexico while we meet the economic sustainability that we all depend upon. And that's a huge challenge, but that is the absolute focus and was, in fact, the intent of Ed Hart when he set up the Institute with his generous endowment. And so that's what we're aimed at, and this is exactly where we want to focus our time. So I want to give our panelists a chance to make a very quick remark. I think I'm almost out of time. Is there any kind of quick comment to make any of you all that we need to conclude with?
I would say that I graduated from LSU and did my dissertation research in the Louisiana estuary, and I have to wince every time I watch some of this oil washing up in the Louisiana marsh area.
And I'd like to close by saying I am an optimist and following up on several questions. You know, we do learn. That's one of the great things about us as a people. We will learn from this. We will have better rules. We will have better mechanisms in place. And I'm pretty confident that the future will be. We won't see this sort of thing happen again, or at least not until we move into the new area and have even newer challenges.
And we've done Gus, but any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I would just say that, there are many people that say, can we really afford to drill oil and gas in a manner that we don't have these situations? And I would respond that, can we afford not to?
No, and I think that really gets at my concluding remarks too, is that we do, and this is something we look at, and the question has come up on communication, should we not drill there at all? And I think everyone is certainly entitled to their opinion as to whether we should be drilling for oil and gas offshore or not, and that opinion depends on anyone's perspective. But while we may be entitled to our own opinions, we are not entitled to our own facts. And the fact is that no matter what kind of optimistic approach we look at for moving toward renewable energy, which we should be doing, whatever that forecast might be and however quickly we can do so, it will not be in our lifetimes that are here in the listening to this broadcast that we will be in a position like that. So unless we're willing to make very drastic changes of all riding buses and not air conditioning or warming our houses. So we're going to be needing oil and gas as part of that energy mix for some time to come, and the place where that oil and gas is in the offshore waters of the Gulf of Mexico and other places like that. So what we have to do is figure out a way to meet that balance, to protect the environment, the Gulf environment that is so important to us, but at the same time meeting that other need, which is really, really difficult, of course. It's not going to be an easy challenge, but that's what's facing us, and that's what we really have to do. Well, I want to thank all of our audience for being here with us today, and remind everyone that we are going to be looking towards other panels as we go into the meeting. We'll talk about that in a second. As soon as I get my kind of timing to you of where we are. The panels, our panels will continue in next week, next Friday. I can't see Mark. Are we done? Sorry. Okay. Our panels will continue next Friday with another series at the same time with another group of experts, and we'll conclude on the third Friday after that. So as we, again, thank you all for being here. I can't see in the back where our time is. I'm sorry, I can't see the signals that are here. What's going on? I'm assuming we are perhaps. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Perdão.